In the late autumn of 1872, the Ozark Hills of southern Missouri were caught between two worlds, one still clinging to the quiet isolation of the frontier, and another slowly waking to the promises and dangers of progress. The McCall estate sat high above the small township of Marion Hollow, a grand but aging structure that seemed to lean with the wind. Its white columns were cracked, the porch sagged in the middle, and ivy had crept so far up its sides that it seemed ready to swallow the house whole. From the road below, it looked peaceful, a remnant of old money and dignity. But those who had lived long enough in the hollow whispered that something in that house had gone wrong a long time. 8G. Sunrise. Fog rolled in thick through the valley, softening the sound of the river and dulling the glow of lanterns that hung from the porch. Inside, the McCall family's servants moved carefully, as if noise itself might break the fragile calm that lingered in those halls. The house had an air of silence that wasn't peaceful. It was tense, watchful, like the walls had been listening for years and were tired of keeping secrets. The McCalls were known for two things in Marion Hollow: their wealth and their misfortune. The family fortune had come from land, miles of forested hills, livestock, and later, a profitable share in the local timber trade. But their fortune had been bought through stubbornness and quiet cruelty. The patriarch, Elias McCall, was a man who believed that money could excuse any sin and that power was something to be held on to, no matter what the cost. He was a tall man with thinning hair, always dressed in black, with eyes that didn't seem to look at people so much as through them. His wife, Clara, was once the kind of woman who brightened any room she walked into. She had come from a modest family in St. Louis, drawn to Elias's charm and ambition when she was still young and hopeful. But years in that house had drained the color from her. Her laughter, once lively and quick, had turned quiet and cautious. The servants said she would sometimes wander the halls late at night, whispering prayers or the names of people long gone. Their 3 children grew up in the shadow of that strained marriage. The eldest, Thomas, carried himself like a man far older than his years. He had inherited his father's cold sense of control, though there was always something restless in his eyes, something he fought to keep buried. His sister, Ruth, was gentle, curious, and far too perceptive for her own good. She had the soft patience of her mother, but when she looked at her father, there was a hint of fear. The youngest, Henry, was still a boy, innocent, shy, and drawn to the quiet corners of the house where he would sketch birds and trees instead of joining the noise of family dinners from the outside. The McCalls lived as many wealthy families did. They hosted gatherings in the summer, brought in musicians from town, and offered donations to the local church. But behind the closed doors of that grand old house, things were different. Some arguments started in whispers and ended with slammed doors. There were sudden silences during meals, when Elias's temper turned the air cold. And always there was talk of inheritance, who it would go to, how much there was left, and whether it would even matter in the end. It was said that Elias had rewritten his will more than once. Each time, a new name was added or struck out. Some said he used it as a weapon, a way to keep control over everyone in the family, reminding them that everything they had, even their comfort, was his to give or take away. The will became a ghost that haunted the house, shaping how everyone behaved, what they said, and what they dared to want as winter crept in that year. The unease grew thicker. The housekeeper, Mrs. Calloway, claimed to hear voices when she cleaned the upper rooms. Servants spoke of footsteps in the hallway long after everyone had gone to bed. Lamps flickered for no reason, and cold drafts came from places no window could explain. It could have been the wind, or it could have been the growing tension between the people who lived there that in town. Whispers began to spread. Someone said Elias had recently made a deal with a banker from Springfield, something to do with selling part of the estate. Another said he had fallen ill, but refused to see a doctor. And yet, others claimed he wasn't sick at all, just growing paranoid. That he locked himself in his study for hours at a time, muttering about betrayal and curses, scribbling names and figures until the ink bled through the page. Those who worked for him noticed the change too. He'd stopped eating with the family, preferring to dine alone. His once booming voice had become sharp and bitter. He accused servants of stealing, even when nothing was missing. He fired one man for looking at him the wrong way. And in the middle of all that fear, Clara grew quieter still, moving through the house like a ghost herself, her eyes hollow and sleepless. Then, in late December, a letter arrived, hand-delivered, sealed with dark red wax. No one knew who sent it, but Elias took it straight to his study and didn't come out for hours. That night, the family here. Him shouting through the door, though no one could make out the words. When morning came, the study was locked, and Elias didn't answer when Clara knocked. It would be days before anyone dared to open that door. For now, the McCall house stood silent, its lights dim, its halls heavy with secrets. The fog outside thickened with each passing day, and the townspeople began to say that whatever was happening up on that hill wasn't just family trouble anymore. It felt darker, like something old and unkind had finally come to collect what it was owed. In the heart of the Missouri Ozarks, where superstition lingered like smoke and bloodlines ran deep, the McCall family story was only beginning. And by the time it ended, no one in Marion Hollow would speak their name without a shiver. Winter settled over the Ozarks like a heavy blanket, trapping the McCall estate in a cold silence that only deepened the unease already crawling through its halls. The snow outside made everything look clean and untouched, but inside, the air was sour with suspicion. Elias McCall no longer left his study for more than a few minutes. He stopped shaving, stopped answering letters, and began locking away papers no one was allowed to see. Every night, the flicker of his lamp burned long after the rest of the family had gone to bed, throwing restless shadows across the frosted windows. At first, the family told themselves it was just another one of his moods. Elias had always been unpredictable, controlling one moment and withdrawn the next. But something was different now. The letter he had received in December seemed to have shaken him deeply. Servants whispered that he had been heard muttering about betrayal and bloodlines, about debts that could never be repaid. Thomas was the first to notice the change in his father's eyes, the way they seemed to dart toward him as if measuring something. He had been trying for years to prove himself worthy of taking over the estate, but Elias always found a reason to keep him at arm's length. Every decision Thomas made was questioned, every suggestion dismissed. And now, with his father growing erratic, the uncertainty began to eat at him. He started drinking quietly in the evenings, pacing the study after Elias went to bed, trying to make sense of the ledger books left open on the desk. The books told a troubling story. The family fortune wasn't what it used to be. The timber business had suffered after a string of accidents, and Elias had borrowed heavily from a man named Samuel Hargrove, a Springfield banker known for his ruthless terms. Thomas realized then that his father had been lying to everyone, keeping up appearances while the family's wealth slipped away. He confronted Elias one night after supper. The dining room fire was nearly out, and the air smelled of smoke and wine. Thomas demanded to know why his father hadn't told him the truth. Elias's response was cold and sharp. He said Thomas wasn't ready to carry the McCall name, that he lacked the strength and the vision to protect what was theirs. When Thomas raised his voice, Elias slapped him. Clara rushed between them, trembling, pleading for calm, but the damage was done. From that night on, Thomas's anger turned inward, darkening into something heavier than resentment. Meanwhile, Ruth had begun noticing other strange things. Letters disappearing from her mother's desk, doors left open that had been locked before, and a faint smell of smoke in the east wing, where no fire had been lit in weeks. One evening, as she passed by her father's study, she heard him speaking to someone in low tones. When she looked through the keyhole, she saw only him, pacing back and forth, talking to the empty air. She told her mother, but Clara just shook her head, her eyes full of quiet dread. Clara herself was caught in her own quiet torment. Years of living under Elias's control had worn her thin, but it was the guilt that truly haunted her. Long ago, before she married Elias, she had been in love with another man, a teacher named Daniel Price. Where her parents arranged her marriage to Elias for the sake of the family's security, she agreed out of duty. Daniel left town, but he wrote to her once years later when Elias was away. That letter had been hidden in a locked box ever since, and lately, Clara found herself taking it out at night, reading it by candlelight, tracing the faded ink with trembling fingers. Unbeknownst to her, Elias had found out about that letter weeks ago. He had hired a boy from town to fetch his mail from the post office, and, in doing so, stumbled upon one addressed to Clara, an old correspondence that Daniel had apparently tried to renew. The discovery fed Elias's paranoia, convincing him that his wife and children were conspiring to betray him. He stopped trusting anyone. He started writing a new will, one that would change everything. The tension bled into every corner of the house. Servants began leaving without notice, claiming to hear footsteps behind them while cleaning or whispers in the cellar. Mrs. Calloway, the housekeeper, tried to keep things together, but even she began to tremble when the study door creaked open at night. Once, she swore she saw Elias standing in the hallway, holding a candle and staring at a blank section of wall as if he could see something no one else could. Thomas's frustration grew unbearable. He began visiting the local tavern, drinking with men who whispered about old money and cursed families. One of them, a trapper named Nolan Pike, told Thomas that his father's land was sitting on something far more valuable than timber, old mineral deposits, possibly silver. But Elias had refused to sell the land years ago, claiming that certain parts of the property were unfit for digging. It was said that an old family burial ground sat there, a place no one touched out of respect or fear. Thomas returned home that night drunk and furious, demanding to see the deed. Elias refused. Their shouting echoed through the house, shaking even little Henry awake. When Thomas finally stormed off, Elias stood alone by the fire, clutching his chest, muttering that his son had become just like his mother, ungrateful, deceitful, and weak. Henry, too young to understand the full extent of what was happening, began having nightmares. He told Ruth that he saw someone standing by his bed at night, whispering his name. She tried to comfort him, but deep down, she believed him. The sense of something unseen, something closing in, had become impossible to ignore. As January dragged on, the family began to unravel. Elias refused to let anyone near his study. Thomas started sneaking in when his father was asleep, searching for the new will he suspected was being written. One night he found a half-burned page in the fireplace, his name crossed out, and Ruth's written beneath it. That discovery broke him. Ruth, meanwhile, grew more worried about her mother. Clara had become detached, staring for long stretches out the window, whispering to herself. She began writing letters again, though she never sent them. Ruth once caught sight of a half-written note addressed to Daniel, and suddenly her mother's quiet sadness made sense. It wasn't just fear, it was heartbreak. Everything reached a fever pitch in early February when Samuel Hargrove, the banker, arrived at the estate. He came unannounced, his carriage wheels crunching over the frozen ground. He was a slick man, tall, with a thin mustache and a confidence that made the servants uneasy. He stayed for 2 days, meeting privately with Elias. When he left, Elias's mood was blacker than ever. The next morning, he told the family that the estate would soon be divided, that he had made his final decision. Thomas exploded, shouting that his father was selling their birthright. Clara tried to calm them both, but Elias turned on her instead, accusing her of betrayal, of poisoning their children against him. She broke down, crying in front of everyone. Ruth grabbed Henry and pulled him away, but she could still hear her father's voice echoing through the halls, filled with rage and something worse, fear. That night, Elias ordered every door locked. He claimed someone had been tampering with his papers. The servants were forbidden from entering his study. Only Clara was allowed to bring him his meals, though he barely ate. She tried to speak to him, but he only stared at her with wild, hollow eyes, saying things that made no sense about the curse of the McCall bloodline, about debts that could never be paid in gold. As the snow began to thaw, the tension finally reached a breaking point. Thomas, desperate and half-mad with anger, decided he would take what was his, by force if he had to. Ruth begged him to wait, to talk things through, but he was past reason. Clara, torn between protecting her son and fearing her husband, prayed every night that something, anything, would stop the spiral they were in. But the house had already turned on itself. Every whisper, every secret, every buried sin had come crawling back to the surface. The inheritance that once promised security now promises destruction. And somewhere deep within that decaying mansion, something, whether madness, guilt, or something older, was pushing them all toward a violent and none of them could escape. By the time the first thaw came to the Ozark Hills, the McCall family was no longer speaking at all. Doors slammed, lamps burned late, and shadows seemed to move on their own. The storm inside the house was building fast, and soon it would break. The night it happened, the air over Marion Hollow was so still it felt unnatural. No wind moved through the trees. No owl called from the woods. The McCall house sat on the hill like a shadow waiting to breathe. Inside, every lamp was lit, and yet the place felt dark, as if light itself was afraid to linger there. Elias McCall had spent the entire day locked in his study again. The family could hear him pacing, his boots scraping the floorboards, his voice rising now and then in muttered bursts of anger. By dusk, Clara had tried once more to reach him. She stood outside his study door, her hands trembling, the dinner tray shaking slightly in her grip. She asked if he wanted to eat, but he didn't answer. Instead, there was a sharp crash from inside, a chair, maybe your glass. She called his name again, more urgently this time. Finally, his voice came, quiet and uneven. "Leave me be," he said. "You've done enough." When she turned away, she didn't see Thomas at the end of the hall, standing in the shadows, listening. He had been drinking again, his shirt half-buttoned, his jaw tight. The smell of whiskey clung to him. He'd heard from one of the servants earlier that Elias had called the lawyer that morning. It could only mean one thing: the will was being signed. And if that was true, everything he had been promised, everything he believed was rightfully his, was about to be taken away. That night, as the grandfather clock struck 10, the house settled into uneasy silence. Clara had retreated to her room with a book she wasn't reading. Ruth and Henry were upstairs, the boy asleep, Ruth sitting by the window, watching the fog roll over the fields. Thomas stood in the hallway outside his father's study, staring at the locked door. He could hear faint movements inside. He told himself he only wanted to talk, to make his father listen, to stop him before it was too late. But there was something darker in him now, something that had been festering for months. The humiliation, the anger, the endless rejection, all of it pressed on his chest like a weight. He knocked once, twice. No answer. His voice came low, strained. "Father, we need to talk." Silence. Then the sound of a drawer opening. A match is being struck. Thomas's heart pounded. He tried the handle. Locked. "Father," he said, louder this time. Still no reply. The smell of smoke began to seep through the door. He didn't think. He acted. He slammed his shoulder against the wood until the latch splintered. When the door flew open, the room erupted with noise, the fire in the hearth roaring, paper scattered everywhere, and Elias standing at his desk, holding the new will in one hand and a pistol in the other. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The flames crackled behind Elias, casting long shadows up the walls. His face looked older, harder, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. "You shouldn't have come in here," he said quietly. Thomas took a step forward. "You're destroying this family," he said. "You're turning us against each other." Elias gave a small, bitter laugh. "You were never with me to begin with. You only ever wanted what was mine." He raised the pistol, not quite aiming it, but enough to make Thomas freeze. "You think I don't see it in your eyes? You'd watch me die just to take my place." Thomas's breath came short. "You've already taken everything. You made sure none of us could live without your permission." His voice cracked then, shaking with rage and years of swallowed words. "But it ends tonight." Elias's hand trembled just barely. "Don't you dare speak to me that way," he hissed. "You're not my equal. You're my failure." Something in Thomas snapped. He lunged forward, knocking the pistol from his father's hand. It hit the floor with a clatter, discharging once, the shot deafening in the small room. The bullet tore through the edge of the desk, sending splinters flying. Clara screamed from down the hall. For a second, time seemed to stop. The two men stared at each other, breathing hard, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. Then Elias struck him, a backhand blow that sent Thomas staggering into the wall. Years of bitterness, of being belittled and dismissed, came boiling out all at once. Thomas grabbed his father by the collar, shoving him backward. They crashed into the desk, scattering papers into the fire. Flames licked up instantly, climbing the curtains, spreading fast. Clara ran in just as Elias fell. She screamed his name, rushing toward him, but Thomas was already there, gripping his father's wrist, forcing him down. "Stop it, Clara Cree. Dee, please stop." But Thomas didn't seem to hear. The two men struggled, their faces inches apart, both gasping, both furious and terrified. Then, suddenly, Elias went still. His head hit the edge of the desk with a dull crack. Thomas froze, staring down at him. The older man's eyes were open but empty, his chest unmoving. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. The fire roared behind them, swallowing the edges of the rug. "Father," Thomas whispered. He shook Elias's shoulder once, gently. Nothing. The reality of it began to sink in like ice through his veins. He stumbled back, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. Clara dropped to her knees beside the body, sobbing. "What have you done?" she whispered. "Oh God, what have you done?" Ruth appeared in the doorway, clutching Henry's hand. The boy's eyes went wide at the sight, his face pale. Ruth pulled him back quickly, her voice trembling. "Go downstairs," she told him. "Don't look." The room was filling with smoke. Thomas moved, toward the window, coughing, panicked. "We have to get out," he said. But Clara wouldn't leave. She kept calling Elias's name, her voice breaking. The fire had reached the shelves now, burning through books and ledgers, sparks raining down around them. Ruth grabbed her mother's arm, dragging her toward the hall. Thomas followed, dazed, half-choking. Behind them, the study was consumed in flames. The papers, Elias's will, his letters, his secrets, all curling to ash. They stumbled into the snow outside, the cold night air hitting them like a slap. Servants rushed out from the quarters, shouting, throwing buckets of water that did nothing against the inferno. The flames lit up the entire hillside, turning the fog into a glowing haze. Thomas stood apart from the others, watching the fire with hollow eyes. His breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. He could still feel the moment his father's body went limp beneath his hands. He could still hear the sound of bone against wood. Clara clung to Ruth, sobbing uncontrollably. Henry sat on the ground, crying into his hands. The fire burned until dawn, leaving only the blackened skeleton of what had once been the McCall home. When the flames finally died, there was nothing left of the study, nothing but charred beams and melted glass. Elias McCall's body was found near the desk, his hand still clutching a half-burned page. The sheriff from town arrived later that morning, asking questions, trying to piece together what had happened. Thomas said the fire had started by accident, that his father had been trapped inside. No one could prove otherwise, but Ruth knew. She saw the way Thomas avoided her eyes, the way his hands shook whenever someone said their father's name. Clara knew too. She said nothing, but her silence was heavy with fear and shame. That night, after the lawmen left, Thomas walked out to the edge of the property, where the fields turned into forest. The snow had melted into mud around his boots. He stood there for a long time, staring at the horizon, the rising sun painting the sky in blood-red streaks. He had what he wanted now, the inheritance, the power, the freedom from his father's shadow. But none of it felt like victory. It felt like a curse, the kind that settled in the blood and never washed away. Behind him, the remains of the house still smoked, and the crows had already begun circling overhead. The McCall family had been broken, and though the world would never know the full truth of what happened that night, those who lived through it would never forget. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the beginning of something much darker. The fire had burned itself out by morning, leaving behind only the faint hiss of cooling embers and the smell of smoke that would linger in the valley for days. The McCall estate, once the pride of Marion Hollow, was now nothing more than a charred skeleton. Its white columns had collapsed inward, its roof gone, the porch buried in ash and debris. People came from town to stare at what was left, whispering to one another in hushed tones. No one said it outright, but everyone suspected that something terrible had happened inside that house long before the fire ever started. The sheriff arrived just after dawn, his horse covered in frost. He found Thomas, soot-streaked and hollow-eyed, sitting on a fallen beam near the ruins. Clara was wrapped in a blanket, silent, staring into the smoke. Ruth sat beside her, holding Henry tightly. They all looked broken, like the fire hadn't just burned their home, but had hollowed out their souls. The sheriff asked questions, his voice low and careful. Thomas told him that his father had been working late, that a candle must have tipped over, setting the papers and curtains ablaze. He said he tried to save him, but couldn't get through the flames in time. His voice stayed steady, but his hands wouldn't stop shaking. The sheriff nodded slowly, making notes, though his eyes lingered on Thomas longer than they should have. He'd known Elias McCall for years, knew his temper, his pride, and the tension that always seemed to hang over that family. He didn't believe the story completely, but without proof, there wasn't much to be done. The will had burned, the study destroyed, and Elias was too dead to contradict anything. The town took pity on the McCalls at first. They sent food, blankets, and condolences. The church held a service for Elias the following Sunday. People came out in good numbers, some out of respect, others out of curiosity. There was talk of how tragic it was, how the fire had robbed the family of everything. But as the days passed, the sympathy began to sour into suspicion. Rumors started in the tavern, then spread through the market and along the church steps. Some said Thomas had been arguing with his father that night. Others claimed they'd heard shouting and a gunshot before the fire. Mrs. Calloway, the former housekeeper, told anyone who would listen that she'd seen the two men fight before, that Elias had feared his son. By the end of the week, the town was divided, half saying it was an accident, half whispering that it was murder. Thomas didn't respond to any of it. He spent his days wandering the property, standing where the house had once been, staring at the blackened ground as if trying to make sense of it. At night, he barely slept. When he did, he woke drenched in sweat, the sound of cracking wood and his father's last gasp echoing in his head. He tried to convince himself it had been self-defense, that he hadn't meant for any of it to happen. But the image of Elias's lifeless eyes wouldn't leave him. Every time he closed his own, they were there, watching, accusing, silent. Clara withdrew from everyone. She stopped speaking to Thomas altogether, barely Eve, and looked at him. Her grief ran deeper than anyone could see. She'd lost her husband, yes, but she'd also lost the man she once loved beneath all the bitterness. And part of her, though she'd never admitted, felt responsible. She believed her silence, her years of quiet endurance, had allowed the hatred between father and son to grow unchecked. Ruth tried to hold the family together, but she was too young to carry that kind of weight. She spent most of her time caring for Henry, who had not spoken a full sentence since the night of the fire. He wandered through the temporary lodging they'd been given in town, clutching one of his old drawings, a picture of the house before it burned. Sometimes Ruth caught him whispering to himself, saying he could still hear Papa calling from the fire. Those words chilled her more than the winter wind ever could have been why spring. The McCalls were no longer welcome in Marion Hollow. People had grown uneasy around them. At the general store, conversations stopped when they walked in. In church, the pew beside them stayed empty. The name that had once commanded respect now brought only discomfort. The inheritance that was supposed to secure their place in the world had instead ruined it. When the legal matters finally came to light, the damage became clearer. With the will destroyed and most of the estate uninsured, the McCall fortune was gone. The land was still theirs, but worthless without the house and timber operations. Samuel Hargrove, the banker from Springfield, arrived weeks later to collect what was owed. He was polite but firm, informing Thomas that debts totaling nearly $7,000 remained unpaid. Thomas signed over most of the remaining property to clear it, keeping only a small portion near the edge of the woods. It was all that was left of generations of wealth and power. After Hargrove left, Thomas spent the evenings sitting by the river, his reflection trembling in the current. He thought about his father, about how everything had led to this moment, every fight, every word, every choice. For the first time in his life, he realized that power and inheritance had never brought peace. They had only brought ruin. Clara's health began to fade not long after. The stress and guilt wore her down until she could barely rise from bed. Ruth took care of her as best she could, but there was no saving her spirit. Sometimes, Clara would wake in the night calling Elias's name, her voice weak, as though she were still trapped in that burning room. She died quietly one spring evening, her hand in Ruth's, the smell of rain drifting in through the window. Her death broke what little was left of the family. Thomas buried her beside Elias on the hill overlooking what used to be the estate. The graves sat side by side, marked by simple wooden crosses. The townsfolk who had once spoken her name with respect now avoided the sight altogether. They said the land felt cursed. After the funeral, Ruth packed what few belongings they had left and took Henry to live with distant relatives near St. Louis. Thomas stayed behind. He said he needed to make things right, though no one knew what he meant. Some thought he was trying to rebuild the house. Others that he was simply punishing himself. He stopped showing up in town altogether. At night, neighbors claimed to see a single light glowing on the hill, long after midnight, flickering like a candle trapped in the dark. Weeks turned into months. Then one morning, the sheriff rode up to the old McCall property after receiving word from an F.A. Romero, who'd found a body near the tree line. It was Thomas. He'd hanged himself from an old oak overlooking the ashes of his family home. In his coat pocket, they found a crumpled note, the writing smudged and uneven. I thought I could outrun it. But the curse isn't the land, it's us. News of his death spread fast, and the people of Marion Hollow didn't know what to make of it. Some said it was justice. Others said it was madness. But everyone agreed on one thing. The McCall name had finally ended, and maybe that was for the best. After that, the land was left empty. The ruins were never rebuilt. Over time, grass and ivy covered what remained of the foundation. Travelers passing through said they could still smell smoke on the wind when the air was heavy, and sometimes if the night was quiet enough, they swore they heard voices, one pleading, one shouting, one crying for forgiveness that in town, no one spoke of the McCalls anymore. Their story became something people warned their children about when they wanted to teach them what greed and silence could do to a family. But those who remembered them, the ones who had seen that house in its glory and in its fall, knew the truth ran deeper. It wasn't just fire that had destroyed the McCalls. It was pride, guilt, and a hunger for control that had eaten them from the inside out. The McCall estate faded into legend, a ghost of the past haunting the Ozark hills. And in the stillness of those woods, where fog drifted through the charred trees and crows circled overhead, it was said that the curse of the inheritance never truly left. It simply waited, quiet and patient, for another name to claim. The trial that followed in the summer of 1873 drew people from every corner of the Ozarks. Wagons lined the dirt roads outside the courthouse, and townsfolk pressed against the windows just to catch a glimpse of the cursed McCall family. What had once been a name whispered with admiration, wealth, old land, and fine manners, had become a symbol of tragedy and shame. The McCalls had fallen not by poverty or misfortune, but by greed, lies, and a legacy that devoured its own blood. Thomas McCall stood in court, his face hollowed by sleepless nights and the weight of guilt. He was not the same man who had once strutted through the estate, proud of his inheritance. His eyes, once sharp and ambitious, were now dull and fixed on the wooden floor beneath his feet. The jury listened to testimonies that painted him as both a victim and a villain. Some said the curse had made him mad. Others believed it was his thirst for control that drove him to violence. When the judge finally declared him guilty of manslaughter, the courtroom fell silent. Thomas didn't protest. He simply nodded, as if the sentence was something he had already accepted long ago, that he was sent to the state penitentiary, a place colder than the Ozark winters and far from the family land he had destroyed. Behind iron bars, he became quiet, reading his Bible and refusing visitors. In his final letter before his execution, because he later confessed to a second hidden crime, one that took the life of his cousin Nathaniel, he wrote only one haunting line: "The land belongs to no one now. It takes back what it's owed." Clara McCall, broken and widowed, returned to the decaying manor. The house had once been a symbol of her family's fortune. Now it was a prison of memories. The walls still carried the faint scent of blood and oil lamps, and the wind that crept through the cracks in the windows sounded like whispering voices. She never remarried. The neighbors said she spent her nights writing letters to the dead, setting them by the fire until they turned to ash. The public reaction was cruel and fascinated all at once. Newspapers called it the curse of inheritance and printed sensational drawings of the McCall estate: dark trees, a crooked gate, a widow in mourning black. People from nearby counties made trips just to see the property. The McCall name became a cautionary tale. Parents told their children to beware of greed, and preachers used the story in sermons about sin and the dangers of pride. But for those who had lived near the family, it wasn't a tale. It was a memory that refused to fade. They remembered the screams on that cold night, the echo that rolled through the valley, and how even the animals had gone quiet. The local sheriff, who had once been friends with Thomas, retired shortly after the case closed. He was seen drinking often, muttering that there were things about that night he'd never speak of again in the years that followed. The McCall land was sold off in pieces. The new owners claimed that the soil was strange. Nothing grew right, no matter how much they worked it. Livestock often fell ill for no clear reason. Some said the land itself was poisoned. Others said it was cursed by the blood spilled upon it. The manor, abandoned for decades, burned down one stormy night. No one knew how it started, but no one tried to stop it either. It felt like the land had finally finished what it had begun. The case left a mark far beyond the McCalls themselves. It exposed how deeply greed could rot a family from within. The inheritance that was supposed to secure their future had become the weapon that destroyed them. It raised questions that lingered long after the trial ended, about the fairness of wealth, the illusion of control, and the way power corrupts even the kindest of hearts. The Ozarks had always been a place where land meant survival, but after the McCall tragedy, people started to see it differently. They whispered that the earth itself keeps a ledger of debts, and no fortune comes without a cost. In many ways, justice was never truly served. Thomas's death didn't bring peace. Clara's suffering didn't cleanse the past. And the land, though stripped of its name and owners, carried the scars of what had been done. The real punishment was not the sentence handed down in court, but the silence that followed, the generations of people who lived nearby and never spoke the McCall name again. Years later, a historian uncovered some of Clara's letters, preserved in a trunk hidden beneath the floorboards of what was once her bedroom. In one, she wrote, "Perhaps the curse was never on the land at all. Perhaps it was on us, the greed that ran through our veins stronger than any bloodline." That line summed up what the entire county had come to believe. The McCall family's fall was not born from magic or myth, but from human nature itself. The hunger for more, the refusal to let go, the pride that makes a person believe they can control everything, even fate. When the story finally faded from newspapers and gossip, it remained alive in the hills, in the quiet spaces between wind and memory. Locals still said that if you walked past the old McCall property on a winter night, you could hear the faint sound of a door creaking or the whisper of a woman calling out for forgiveness. The tale of the cursed inheritance became a mirror for the people of the Ozarks, a reminder that wealth built on cruelty and lies always crumbles, that no family, no matter how powerful, can escape the truth forever. And as the years passed, the McCall name became a warning carved into the collective memory of the land. That justice may come slowly and not in the way people expect, but it always comes quietly, steadily, like the wind through the pines, carrying the weight of everything left.